goodie. So if you're going to do a lightning talk, put your name up here. Philip's taking the first pick. Sorry guys, you don't get the Charleston Chicken.
I don't see lightning talk.
Okay,
There's name. All right. Well,
And it doesn't have to be TypeScript related. It can be anything. If you guys have a cool tool you found out about, it could be anything.
And the larger you write their name, the longer you're going to talk for.
Right. So you have to do this bigger than Philip.
So my name is James. If I haven't, I recognize a lot of faces, but if this is your first time here, my name is James, and this is Kim.
I'm Ken.
Kim, welcome back.
Yeah, it's been a while.
It's great to see you.
I'm good. I'm back.
So we're co-hosts for this meetup, and we're coming up on 2 years now. It'll be 2 years in April.
April, right?
I don't think we have anything.
You have to put your name on the board. And you're doing a lightning talk.
Go ahead.
You're good.
All right. Don't think we have anything special planned as of yet, though I have been talking with the TypeScript team, and they're prepared to make another trip down like they did a year and a half or so ago.
Where we see
Daniel.
Daniel in particular, or so Daniel's the team lead at Microsoft that manages TypeScript.
He's interested, but he hasn't fully committed to it yet. The Microsoft Build Conference is coming up in May, so we may need to wait until that's done before they can commit to something, I would imagine. Because I would expect that there's going to be something TypeScript related announced at Build.
What else could we want? 2.2 was just released. Come on.
2.5? 3? I don't know. Is it too early to be talking about TypeScript 3? Did you guys
about Angular 4, so why not?
Angular 4 what? Have you guys heard the statement that Microsoft doesn't get anything right until they get to 3.0? Have you guys heard that before?
Is that why Windows 3.0 was their first?
Yes. So I don't know. I think they might have done better this time around on TypeScript, but who knows what they've got in store, so maybe we'll change our mind. So we're going to finish up announcements real quick. I've got a presentation about migrating to TypeScript, which I'll get into in just a bit. I don't know how long I'll go. I haven't given this talk before, and I didn't get a chance to do a run through this afternoon. So I'll just kind of keep an eye on the time, and I'll try not to talk all night long. So we can do lightning talks, and Philip has volunteered. That's awesome. There. He's like, where did you sit? YTS, excellent. So I won't cover a lot of that then. I have a little bit of that in my presentation, but we'll just defer that. We'll create a promise that will come later.
We won't reject that promise.
Are you going to talk?
I haven't. I'll wait until your talk's over to make my decision. But,
oh no.
You
know what that means? He's going to see how badly I flub.
Most likely, I'm just going to fill the gaps. No, I've thought about what I'm going to talk about, but I haven't committed.
What else? Ground rules. We've never really talked about this kind of stuff before, but I've been inspired this year to say things that might be obvious, because I don't think they're obvious anymore. But this group is open to everyone. We welcome any thought, any questions. Please make yourself comfortable while you're here. And if there's anything we can do to make you feel comfortable or make you more comfortable, please let us know what that is. Restrooms are through that door. And it's a choose your own adventure kind of style.
Right. We have about 3 different.
Yeah. Break room is right in this room here, and we have some drinks. You can grab a glass and get yourself some water. There's some small snacks,
some granola bars and whatnot.
Yeah, but please make yourself comfortable. And while we're talking about the space and what's in the break room there and the restrooms, CSG is the company that occupies the space. They're a consultancy, and they do us a solid every meeting they posted, and they posted again tonight. So thank you to CSG for doing that. It's nice, yeah. It's very, very nice not having to wonder where you're going to do your meeting month to month, right? I know that's a luxury because not every group. I know some groups they get caught in this weird space where they don't have a regular spot, and it's hard. So I really appreciate them doing that for us. Anything else? We don't have a topic for next month. So if you feel the spirit move you, so to speak, to want to talk about something in a longer, slightly longer format, whether that be 15 minutes, 30 minutes, 45 minutes, whatever, please let me know. Reach out to me. I'm on Twitter, on SmashDev. You can hit me up on the Meetup, whatever you feel comfortable with, and let's talk.
We do have a Slack channel. If anybody wants to join, there's an invite. If you go to TypeScriptPDX.com, you can find the invite link.
And there's generally a lot of activity there.
Yeah, that's a global global Slack channel, so people from all around the world join. So
I think it gets mistaken sometimes for being like an
Yeah.
official Slack.
I've had to point people into the right direction. So if you have questions about learning TypeScript, we're okay. But if you have questions about the implementations and the bigger problems that you might be coming up, then the Gitter channel is the better way.
Right, or GitHub and file an issue.
Right.
Or something like that. Yeah. But don't let that deter you. Come there and make fun of us.
Right.
All right. Anything else before we start?
No.
Okay.
Let's do it.
All right. We are. In case you haven't been here before, we've missed a couple of meetings, but we try to record these, so that's what is happening here. We're actually live streaming right now, so and we try to do that every month. So if you can make it downtown and you just want to like tune in for a little bit, that option typically is available. So just be aware of that. And we try to post that on the Meetup information itself, and I just also tweeted it as well. So, all right, cool. So, this is going to be interesting because I normally present from my Mac, but I wanted to use it to stream tonight, so I'm working off of my Surface, and I haven't used my Surface much lately. So, I'm having to readjust which key is the control key. Okay, so I have a few slides, and we'll just quickly kind of go through those. And the bulk of it, this presentation, is taking a very simple web app that has a very simple Node API, and we're just going to kind of group, mob code and convert this thing to TypeScript. We may not get all the way through it, but as we start like doing things within there, that's going to uncover lots of stuff to talk about, and I'm sure you're going to have lots of questions too. So I think you'll get the most out of this if you stop me and ask your questions. Let's make it more of a group conversation, so please do that. So in terms of like the preamble here, so the idea that I had with this presentation was to think of an application, and hopefully this mirrors something in your own like professional life. An app that's been maybe built for a while, so it's an existing application. Maybe it started small, but like over time and yeah, I heard a conversation before the meeting. I swear I had this prepared before I heard this, but it's a very common thing, right? You start with a very sensible sized app or something that's easy to wrap your mind around, and then over time, it just kind of gets, it's like the ball of mud, design pattern. Things just get slapped onto it, and it grows and grows, and maybe even like it's had like a history of developers working on it. And I've worked on apps before, and maybe you can relate, where you look at a piece of code, and the style that it's written, you go, oh, that's circa 2006 when Joe worked here, or you know what I mean? Like, it's funny how people leave like their fingerprints on the code base, and sometimes that never goes away. So that's the idea. Now, this app is sort of like intentionally and purposefully much smaller than any of those kinds of examples, because we can't have like hundreds and hundreds of files, otherwise we'd get so lost in it that we would never be able to cover what we want to cover. But that's the idea, right? That this is sort of a small piece of what that bigger problem would be. And I didn't come up with this. I tried to remember who said this, but if you're not careful, JavaScript can quickly become a write-only language. Have you guys ever heard? If you Google like write-only programming, there's like jokes and serious discussion about which languages are mostly write-only versus read-only versus whatever. And JavaScript has kind of a bad reputation, whether it deserves it or not. I'll leave that up to you to decide, as being a write-only language, meaning that it's very easy to write code that's so difficult to understand that others cannot change it. And so they don't change it, and it just sits there forever. So we want to prevent that, right? We want to do whatever we can to stop that. So what do we need? Well, we need better tooling to support like typos, right? Like I'm typing a property on this object and I want to know that I'm just not like getting it wrong. Improved code discoverability and navigation. This is something that we'd kind of take for granted with statically compiled languages like C# and Java, but this is not easy to achieve when you're developing in JavaScript. Again, tooling support, ability to refactor. So if you want to rename something and know definitively that you're not just doing like a string search and saying, hey, find every string in my app that's named name, right? And having to like go line by line and to say, is that a property reference? No, I'll change this one, I won't change this one. Tooling should be able to help you with that. And another one I thought of was leverage newer JavaScript features. You know, JavaScript thankfully is being, you know, iterated on as a language much quicker than it ever has before. So it'd be really great if we had a convenient way to leverage features as we see the need to use them, and then let the tooling or our, you know, development workflow just down compile so we don't have to worry about whether it's supported or not. So how can we achieve some of these things? Well, you know, I think a really obvious answer is testing. Testing can help provide a safety net, you know, when you need to go and make changes, but not every application has good code coverage or maybe any tests at all, right? So you're left with making a decision of whether or not you invest money in writing unit tests or something else. I think I'm not going to sit here and say you shouldn't be writing unit tests. You should be. But I have certainly worked in a lot of situations where, especially on a short schedule, it wasn't practical. So it'd be nice to have something that gave you some part of that, right? Tooling can help. If anyone's ever used WebStorm, it's a fantastic JavaScript editor. Like, it surprisingly does a lot of stuff that you're going to see things light up inside of Visual Studio Code because of TypeScript's language service. WebStorm's been doing that for years, and if you're like a regular WebStorm developer, you might find yourself looking at some of this stuff and going, yeah, we've had that, dude, like for a long time, you know. But other tooling like Atom, this stuff isn't like readily on hand. Babel is a great tool if you're interested in doing transpilation or down compiling down to ES5 or ES3. Static typing, TypeScript's not the only player. Flow is produced by Facebook. It's not as popular as TypeScript, but they're working on it, and it's updating quickly, and so who knows where we'll be in a year or two from now in terms of, you know, its capabilities. I will say that I don't know a lot about Flow, but I believe this is an accurate statement, but correct me if anyone here knows any different. I don't think Flow, they haven't like bridged that gap into like the editor space yet. Like Flow is more of a compilation check. You run it, you issue a command against your code base, and it tells you whether you have any errors, but it's not giving you like some of the tooling stuff that you're going to see here in terms of refactoring and auto-completion. I don't think, anyway. So if you know any different, please let me know. So what is TypeScript? So real quickly, for those of you who, is anyone here just like you're coming here for the first time because you're wanting to learn, and this is the first you've ever heard of TypeScript? Don't be afraid to raise your hand if that's true. Okay. So this is like the elevator pitch, if you will. It's a superset of JavaScript. You're familiar with CoffeeScript? Somewhat. So CoffeeScript compiled down, or down to JavaScript, but it didn't look like JavaScript. Like it had its own syntax, right? Intentionally, they did that. TypeScript is different in that. Oh, thanks. And that it embraces JavaScript. So you can just take a JavaScript file, as you'll see in a minute, just change the extension, and it becomes TypeScript. It also adds optional static typing, which we'll take a look at, meaning that you can say when a parameter or a variable is supposed to be a certain type. It doesn't add any types beyond what are already there, so number, string, Boolean, those kinds of things. But it makes it static at design time. And then features from the future. So your ability to use things that aren't like widely supported in the browsers, because it's going to down compile that to something that is widely supported in browsers. One of the main points of this presentation is this idea of incremental migration. We didn't used to have this. I think it was around version 1.8 that they added this ability for the TypeScript compiler to say, not only can .ts files be input sources, but .js files can be. And what this did, it seemed like a very simple thing, but it was a huge change. Because what it did is it allowed you inside of one project to have some of your files be regular vanilla JavaScript and some to be TypeScript files. And what you'll see in a minute is that these files, it's not just that they're in islands unto themselves, they actually can like understand code in each space. So what that allows you to do is to migrate piecemeal, as you have time or as it makes sense to do so. That's pretty much my content. And I like how it just like starts to go through my slides there automatically. I've never used, what is it? This is called the slides, I guess. This is Google Slides. Maybe my arrow key is sticking. Okay, so here is my app. Now, I am going to use Visual Studio Code. Who here has not seen Visual Studio Code or not used Visual Studio Code? Okay. I don't like the fact that they named it Visual Studio, like tied it to that brand at all, because it's, even though there's now beginning to be some overlap, ironically, because Visual Studio proper is borrowing some things from Visual Studio Code, it's like a completely different product. It's not an IDE, it's an editor plus some. Like they're trying to fit, like if you think of the entire gamut between editor, just stripped down editor and IDE, they're falling tilted towards editor, but some distance towards an IDE with capabilities and features. One of the reasons why I'm using code and not like Atom, which I used for a long time to show these kind of TypeScript presentations, is that it works a lot better with vanilla JavaScript than Atom does. And I still think that's true today, and I don't know like what's the holdup for the Atom TypeScript plugin to do some of these things. Maybe it's the bridge between the plugin and the underlying editor. I'm not sure. But
what features are missing in Atom that are in
so in just about 60 seconds, what you're going to see here is that, so this project has no TypeScript in it whatsoever. It's just vanilla JavaScript. But what Visual Studio Code is doing is that it's running the TypeScript Language Service, which is called Salsa, is like its code name. It's using that behind the scenes to look at the JavaScript in your project and to make sense of it, right? So let me give you a concrete example of that. I'm going to collapse these top level folders just so we can see what's here. Oh, this is the wrong folder. Hang on, guys. Okay, now let me close, just so I don't get lost in this one again. Okay, so I'm using Node.js for my API. That's why I have a Node modules folder here. There's a bunch of dependencies in there, but I'm not gonna worry. Primarily I brought in Express, and that it brings in about 36 other packages. So if you look at here, there's a bunch of things in Node modules, but that's always the case, so just kind of ignore that. We have a public folder and a server folder. The server is all of the code for the API, and it is pretty simple. We'll keep coming back to these files, so don't worry about exactly how this is laid out, but there's an index.js. If you're unfamiliar with Node, we're going to kind of split the presentation between this Node API and a regular web client. So if you want to just tune out this part, that's up to you. I haven't done much Node development, so if you see me do if I'm doing something boneheaded here, please let me know, because I want to continue to learn and get to be better. But this is a very basic Express app. It has exactly one route, and that's this books routes. And we'll take a look at what that returns, but it just returns some simple JSON that represents like technical books. It also serves up as a static route. or as static files, this public folder. And in the public folder is an index.html file. And as you can see, this is a very simple HTML file. There's one element that's the heading, one that's an empty div, and 3 script includes. So we have to vendor jQuery.min.js. It's so funny, when I went to write this past few days, I was like, I didn't want to get hung up. Like, I thought about doing React, and I thought, no, because then it like quickly turns into a discussion around React development. And I thought about using Knockout, which I used years ago on a project, but I don't remember hardly anything about it. So I was like, well, I'd have to relearn that. And I thought, well, I'll use jQuery because we probably all have used it at some point in time, maybe even today. And it just kind of like keeps the complexity low. And then there's the data.js, which is, we'll see, is a very simple file, and an app.js. So that's our client, okay? And it's all just written in vanilla JavaScript. If we come over here, there's exactly one call being done, and I don't even have it on a document.ready. I'm just putting this at the bottom of the body so that the elements or the DOM is ready for this. I say get data, and then I say done, which is, you know, their pseudo promise like, you know, API. And then I'm basically looping through the data and building up this string that represents the list of books that I got back from the API. Now, what's interesting, and this is kind of the point I wanted to get at, is that if I put my cursor on get data and I press F12, of course now it's not going to work. Get data.
About that lens thing?
Well, you should be able to navigate.
Not control.
F12 should bring up, should take you to definition, and that's not working. Let me try reopening the folder.
Did you load it types?
No, this was kind of the whole point. Is out of the box, Visual Studio Code like just immediately starts to look at your project and will allow you to do some things without having to introduce any trace of TypeScript into your project. Now, of course, now it's not working. So we'll come back to that. And I'm not sure why that's not working. Trying to think if there's anything that I did differently between this afternoon when I ran through this and just now.
What do you expect?
What's that?
What do you expect from the guy?
You should be able to navigate to the definition, which is in another file.
Do you have the definition?
Huh? Yeah, and that's over here. What's that?
Do you need to compile it?
Mm-mm. No, the language service just runs in the background, and you'll notice that when you hover over this, we get the colon any at the end of that. For any of you who have seen TypeScript, that's the language service saying that's what the return type is of any, but because we haven't done any typing in here, it's not able to tell us anything beyond that it's going to be a value, it's going to be of type any.
Now you can open it, try it one more time.
There it goes.
Ah.
Huh. Oh, I didn't have the file open. Okay. So I must have had the file open earlier this afternoon when I did this. Good call. Okay, so we're actually going to be able to get around this issue by adding, we can actually, so this is automatically happening, but you can add a config file to the root of your folder that's your project, right? Once you add that config file in there, we shouldn't have to do this anymore. So let's go ahead and do that just to show that that's the case. So I'm going to add to the root of public, which is my client-side app, I'm going to add a jsconfig.json. This is a config file for the TypeScript compiler. Now, granted, we don't have any TypeScript files in our project, but we can start to tell the compiler like how we want things to be to be handled,
And
right?
you want that in the public folder like that?
Where did I put it here?
Is that a code with the TS config? Is that
Yes.
similar to that?
A JS config is a TS config with allow.js set to true. Otherwise, it's the same. Now, there are some compiler settings that don't make any sense if you're not using TypeScript. So you can't set every compiler setting, but you can set the ones that, and they have a list online in documentation that tells you which settings you can use and which settings you can't use. So to answer that question, I'm actually going to end up with a JS config in the client and a TS config in the server in two different folders.
Okay.
So I don't want to put it in the root of the project because I don't want it to apply to my server code. I'm going to treat those as separate things. But what I want to look up here is to make sure that I'm, okay. So compiler options is where you can set configuration on the compiler. And one of the things that I'm going to do is I'm going to say that I want the target to be ES5 instead of ES6. And what this is going to allow, like you'll notice, and this is kind of hard to see, but I'm using backticks here. So these are template strings or string templates. Which way is it? Template strings? I said it right the first time. So by down compiling this to ES5, I'll be able to close that issue that someone put into our issue track system and said, hey, on my old Nexus 1.0 phone, it's not working correctly, right? So we're going to transpile that down to ES5, and then the out directory here. Oh, you know what? I totally missed a step because you can't. I'm trying to compile. Well, ultimately, what I want to do is I want to compile these JS files into the public folder. Well, I'm in the public folder right now, so I'm not going to be able to overwrite my input files. If I tried this, it would just keep me from doing it. So what I want to do is go into my project and say a new folder, and then I'm just going to name this client, and then I'm going to copy over all of these files into a new folder called client. And then inside of here, I'm going to delete JSConfig. Okay, so now, just to make sure we're all on the same page here, now we have a client folder that is our source files. And that's where the JSConfig lives, not in public. And then we can say, not pity. I'm going to set the pity flag. What this does is when you're a complete bonehead, and like I am going to do, and you keep typing the right thing, it takes pity on you, and it just knows what you're trying to do. Forgive me. No, it's outdir, and then I'm going to set that to go up a level and then to public. Okay, and we'll hook this into our npm start script, but for now, I'm going to do this. I'm going to run it from the command line. So I'm going to say tsc, and that's the TypeScript compiler, and then I'm going to say -p, so I can tell it what my config file, like what my project lives, and then I can say client JSConfig JSON. We didn't get any errors, so that's encouraging. In fact, if we went into public, well, actually, we can just look at the result here. You can see now that if we go into app, those backticks are gone, and the TypeScript compiler has turned that into just a regular string concatenation. Okay, that's really our first evidence that something has changed in our code. But aside from that, for those of you who haven't seen this, notice that the compiler doesn't like absolutely mangle what your original JavaScript looked like, which is really nice. Okay, so now that we have that, and if we go back into our source file, which is app.js, notice that when I hover over this, now I can press F12 and it opens the file because that JSConfig is telling the compiler this is my project. And so it's now proactively going out and looking for JS files to bring into that project for compilation, but also for the language service here. And in fact, not only can we navigate, but if I do, so that was F12. If I do Shift F12, and let me give myself a little more room here. Shift F12 will find all references. So over here on the right, we can click on that, and we're taken to the index, or excuse me, app.js, and it highlights it in yellow there, or we can go back to the definition. So again, imagine, like I said in the beginning, this isn't necessarily simplistic, small, arbitrary app, but imagine if you had dozens or hundreds of files in your project that referenced like a shared library, and you needed to know definitively like who's calling me. This is a really, really, like it seems like a trivial thing on the surface, huge time saver. The other thing that we can do, and you notice too, that this is a pretty cool Visual Studio feature. This is actually something well, I was going to say they borrowed this from Visual Studio proper, but I'm going to take that back. I actually think when Visual Studio Code, before it was released, it was Visual Studio Monaco, which was a browser-based editor that you could use within Microsoft's Azure service. You could peak definition there, and I want to say that was the first time that someone had seen peak definition. What peak definition does, for those of you who haven't seen it, is that, and I'm going to make my screen a little smaller because normally we all have bigger monitors, right? When you peek it, notice that I haven't left the app.js file, and I'm seeing the definition for that in line. What's nice about that, and you can actually even, this is live, like you could edit this and then press escape, and you're right back to where you were. So it's a really nice way to go take a look at something, to either make a change or just to read the code without leaving the context of where you're at. Something else that we can do, we can put our cursor on get data, press F2, and we could say get data 2. And as soon as I do that, it changed the one place that we're invoking the method as well, or the function. And again, that's a really simple, arbitrary example. But imagine, going back to what I said earlier, that you had a name property on a constructor function or on a class, but you might have, it's not unusual for name to be reused as a property on a lot of different types of objects, but you may only want to, let's say you want to change name, in this case on a book, to title, and we only want to change this one class and not everywhere that the string name appears. You can do this reliably because we have the TypeScript Language Service, the compiler, behind the scenes knows specifically that that's that property that we want to change.
So it just changes the scene.
Yes. Okay, real quickly, so that's Salsa language service. This is like what I was mentioning earlier, that Visual Studio proper is borrowing things from Visual Studio Code. In Visual Studio 2017, Salsa is now the JavaScript editing engine inside of Visual Studio proper. So everything that you're seeing here in code, you get the same behavior in Visual Studio itself now. But it was here first for free. Any questions about, so again, keep in mind, we've done 0 TypeScript, right? We added a JS config file, and we started configuring some properties there, but we haven't had to change our code at all. Something else that we can, and I won't bother taking the time to show this, but there's some compiler options. Like for instance, you could set no implicit returns or no fall through cases in switch statements. So if you made a mistake in your code, the compiler can start to tell you like, oh, there's some unreachable code here, or you have a switch statement that's written probably in an unexpected way. The compiler can start to warn you about those things, again, without having to do any TypeScript. So if we take a look at, so this is our client app. Let's go take a look at our Node application. And there's the Express side of it, we're not actually going to look at that at all tonight. I really set that up just so I had a way to take these models that I have that are just some simple data structures and return that as JSON to my client. So that's the only reason why it's there. This is the part that I wanted to use as a demo. So I have a book.js file, and inside of here I have a very simple ES6 class. It has a constructor. It defines 3 properties: a title, a publisher, and an array of ratings. And then there's an add rating method, which takes a username, a rating, and a comment. So the idea here is that it's a collection of books, displays on a page, and then users could say, hey, that's a 5 out of 5, and they could leave a comment. So I have a book, and we have a rating. And this is not even a class. This is just set up as a constructor function. But that's required here. But you'll notice that if I hover over where I'm newing an instance of that, we're already getting some auto-completion and some help here. Visual Studio Code is able to tell us that when we new up an instance of that, I need to pass in a username, a rating, and a comment. But, like we mentioned just a second ago, the type on each of those is any. So it's still not able to tell us what the expected type is. To understand, we would either have to have written this code ourselves, or we would have to go look at the definition of the file. Even that's not very informative, right? Well, what is rating supposed to be? Is that a number or is that a string? I don't know. Could be any of those things. So one of the things that we can do, again, I'm going to keep drumming on this, instead of going to TypeScript, which would be an obvious solution, and we'll do that in just a second, we're going to add a JSDoc comment to this. So we can say param string username. So this is their username for the rater. That's not even really good English, but I'm going to go with it. So number, rating. This is the rating that the user is giving. And then we can say param string comment. What's that?
Normally it's the username, the user, rating. The rating.
It's really painful for me to type this out like this, so yeah, this is the comment. See comment. This is the comment that the user is giving. Okay. And then it doesn't return anything. That's just, this is the constructor. So we should be able to, now that we've added that, with any luck, I don't know, after that first failure, I was beginning to wonder there. But now notice when we hover over this, now we're actually seeing that it's telling us what the types are. One of the cool things about the ability, and what's happening here is that the TypeScript compiler is reading and parsing and understanding the JSDoc comments. One of the cool things about this is that once we switch over to using TypeScript, we do not have to move these types in line like you would expect. They can stay as JSDoc comments, and its behavior would be exactly the same as if we added the explicit types down here next to the parameters. Yep.
Now, you don't have the compiler running in the background. This is the language service. That's a great question, so thanks for asking that.
This is Visual Studio Code running the TypeScript language service, that salsa language service, under the covers while we're writing our code. And so no, I am not having to invoke a compilation step. This is just, the moment we start typing in our file, it's basically watching what we're doing and trying to understand what's happening.
Does Visual Studio Code do that by default?
Yes. Yeah, in fact, there may be an option to disable that, but I don't know why you would, to be honest.
One of the questions that I had, and I know the answer to this, but the typing that you gave there, does that prevent you from supplying a Boolean or some other thing?
So you might, thank you for the lead in. So we could go through our code base and add JSDoc comments, which has value outside of type information, right? Like if we built into our build workflow, our build process, the ability to extract out JSDoc comments into documentation, imagine that, documentation for your code base. This is a gateway into doing that, right? But it also gives us some of this editor support that's pretty cool too. Now, Ken asked a great question. We see that information here, but if we say new rating, so if I say let R equals new rating, and I pass in a number and a string for rating and false for the comment, there is no error. So one of the downsides, so everything I've been showing you is ways that you can just make sort of small little changes to your environment, or in this case, adding some comments to your code, which are not changing the code itself, and you get better editor support. But it's not going to do anything beyond that. It's not going to break the build if you call something incorrectly. So you lose that part of the safety net, and therein is your reason for going further and moving on to TypeScript, right? This is actually, you might wonder, like, well, why don't they? Well, the problem is at the moment you flip that TypeScript switch on and say, I want to start writing in TypeScript, it's less forgiving, and things will start to break in your code, guaranteed. Things will break in your code base that work at runtime, and you'll be like, what the hell? You know, like I have to fix this just to get it to build, you know? So that's what the rest of this talk is going to be, basically, is starting to turn TypeScript on and seeing what breaks, right? Because there's just no way around it. Unless your app is like super, super arbitrary, which chances are it's not. You have a lot of experience doing conversions. I mean, it always breaks. Oh. And some of it is going to be that you have to just like make your code written in a way that TypeScript can understand it. Some of it is going to be errors in your code that you like didn't implement a pattern properly, or maybe it is a bug, you know, and you need to fix it. So
a lot of the times at the top of a JavaScript or a TypeScript file, you'll see a collection of about 20 declared var any, and that's the way around it. Until you get the entire app type.
Yeah. So let's do that. That's a great segue, and let's go ahead and take that plunge here. Time check 6:45. So what I want to do now is in the server folder. Let me think about how I did this earlier. I have the same problem that I did earlier, in that I want to have a folder for my source and a folder for my distributable files. And for better or for worse, I put like everything is all part of the same, you know. Like my package. I don't know if you noticed that my package.json is in the root of my project, but I don't have one for my client and one for my server. So the more I started working on this, I started feeling a little bit of tension with how I had like this one world view, but yet I wanted to treat my compilation as separate projects. What's your opinion on that?
So yes, you do want to keep your server as its own TS config,
yep.
or JS config, or whatever
yep.
you're going with, and your client being separate. Those
yep.
are two different projects, need to have two different project definition files.
In the same repo.
It could be in the same repo, yeah. As far as where you want to put your out files, if it's server and you have a Webpack build, then you're going to do like a Webpack out, whatever.
Right.
But if I keep,
but now you're talking client.
Right. Well, no. Webpack does bundling for the back end too. So,
really?
So you can have a Webpack bundle for the back end or front.
Why would you bundle your node modules? They're not
Tree
moving over the
shaking.
wire, right?
No.
It's going to do tree shaking.
It's going to do tree shaking. If you want to have it as part of a deployment package, then you can have one file that goes.
So if you're deploying your node, so you're talking about creating NPM packages for public consumption.
We shouldn't talk about this right now, but yes, if you want to.
That's not my scenario
if
here.
If you want to create for public use, yes.
Okay, I see what you're saying. That if you're that's where size would matter, because you may have thousands or tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of downloads, and that adds up. And people would get upset if they were downloading a bunch of things that didn't need to be there.
And your dependencies are specific to your package, so
Right.
why mix all the other dependencies in the package?
Oh, got it. Because so you're not just tree shaking your code, you're tree shaking everything you're dependent upon and whether or not it's needed. Gotcha.
So-
that makes a lot of sense.
But however, in a node environment, if you had a server application, which we do, you would just have it out into the same directory in which the project existed. You don't need to create a dist folder, for instance, a source and a dist folder.
I'm going to, because I'm not going to convert all my files to .ts.
That's why.
I actually tried to do what he just said. Just say, hey, just compile in place and let the .js files sit next to the .ts. But that's not what I want to do. I'm going to just change.
Also, if you do what I'm suggesting, you'll need to clean your folder. You need to have a cleaning process to get all of your JS out when you decide to delete a TypeScript file.
So, continuing on, so the bottom line here is that what you're seeing here, don't necessarily take this as best practice, and I'm sure there's probably dozens of ways that you can organize your projects and skin this cat, so to speak. This happens to be one way, and I might change my mind tomorrow. So just take that with a grain of salt. What I am going to do, though, is I'm going to create an SRC for source folder inside of server, so I can keep all of my server code in server, but I'm going to have a source, and I'm going to output to a dist folder. So what I need to do now is I'm going to move routes and data into source. Really? Hang on. What was the... Let me try this again. All right, so data. I don't know why that was complaining. Okay, so now I have source, which should have, if I didn't mess it there. Okay, so it's still the same structure. And now I'm going to add in the root, and this doesn't need to be this way. We could add this tsconfig up in the root of server. I went ahead and put it in the source folder. It didn't affect the ability to do what I wanted to do, so I just went with that. So I'll set my compiler options. I'll set my target, and this I'm going to set. It's interesting to default it to ES3. Sure, ES3. What the heck, man? What could go wrong? I'm going to leave my target at ES6, so the class that we have in that book.js should stay as a class. I am going to set allow.js to be true because I'm not going to convert every file. You'll see that we're going to convert exactly one initially. And then my outdir is going to be up a level dist. And then if we come over here and let's compile this now. So we'll say server with src tsconfig JSON.
You can actually leave off the tsconfig JSON on that. It'll do that.
That did not work for the JSON config, by the way.
For the JS?
Now making me a liar. Yeah.
Okay, you're right.
So for whatever reason, the compiler
It
does.
only looks for the tsconfig. Right?
Yeah. So when I did the JSON config first. When I got the tsconfig, I just like, oh, I know how to do this. Wrong. So now we have a dist folder, and inside of here we have this basically right now the same files. What we want to go in and do is inside of data and models, we're going to rename this book.js, and we're going to have our first TypeScript file. And you'll notice as soon as I did that, things started breaking. It's like cannot find name require, and you might find yourself wondering like, what? Like, it was working fine before, you know, like why can't it find it? And then this one is great too. It says, oh, property title does not exist on typebook. TypeScript is very particular. This is one of the many sort of like quirks about classes in TypeScript. You have to be explicit. So while I'm defining these, I could just say title, and you notice the error went away. But then title is still just of type any. So since we're using TypeScript, we can actually add static typing or explicit typing right there next to our definition. So we can say publisher, and that's a string, and then we'll say ratings is an array of rating. And that's not happy because my require is broken and it can't find rating. So let's fix require. What needs to happen in this case is that we have to add what's called a typings file for Node itself, because Node is providing the require function that I'm calling here, and TypeScript doesn't know that this is a Node application.
I have a question.
Yep.
Is there something in the TS config you can say use common or whatever?
Yeah, absolutely. But that still doesn't give you the type information.
Nodes required.
Correct. It's what it's wanting to know is you need to tell me, and what Ken was saying earlier is we could do this, declare require. Oh, thank you. Declare var require any. Done. They call and we could put this in a file in the root of our project where we just start declaring all these var any's everywhere. This is what they call an escape hatch. If you run into one of these dependencies and you're like, I don't want to deal with this now, I just want to get to the thing I'm working on, you can do this. This is very much what I would call code debt. That every time you add one of these, it's something that you're probably going to need to come back at some point, because you effectively said, I want to use TypeScript so the compiler can help me, but now I've cut myself off at the knees by saying I don't want to let the compiler do its job. So not recommended to do. So what we're going to do instead is from here, from the command line, and I'm just in the root of my project, which it's actually pretty cool that this is going to work. Remember, my node modules was in the root, which is like several levels up now from the folder that we're working in. But I can say npm install @types/node, and then I'll say save dev, because this is not needed at runtime. This is just a design time concern. @types is a special, what do they call that? It's a
Well, no, it's not a namespace. It's a.
There's a name for it. It's called a package. It's not collection. Package. Is it scoped package? Does anybody remember?
I'll buy that.
Anyway, there's a way that you can basically group packages together inside of a name, so it looks like it's a package, but it's actually, in this case, a very scoped package. It's a very large collection. Like, there's thousands of packages in here. So normally, if Node is the thing we want to install, I can just say @type/node. We're also using Express. So while I'm here, I'm going to go ahead and install that one too, because I know I need it. So I can say npm install @types/express and bring that one in too. We haven't talked about interfaces, but I'm going to write one in just a bit. So the order on this is a little out of step. What these type definition files are just collections of interfaces and interfaces in modules. There's no implementation. It's just a description of what that API actually looks like. And annoyingly so, I have found that you typically need to reopen the file. I don't know.
You can command or
I don't have the
Control-Shift-P and then type in reload TypeScript.
Close the file and reopen. What is it? Oh, you bring up the command palette.
You can bring up the command palette and then type in reload TypeScript server or something. Service.
Huh. Genius. So if you do that, you don't. If you had like 5 files open, you don't have to go. That's much better. I'll admit that. Thanks for the pro tip, Ken. So it still cannot find the name rating. Now I'm going to go. I haven't even run this app yet, so I'm going to show that we have what's effectively it's a compilation. Well, it is a compilation error. If we come down here, I'll zoom in super close. You'll notice that there's this X with a 1 next to it, and if we click on that, that's the TypeScript compiler telling us we have a compilation error that it can't find the name rating. And if we go in and we run TSC in our server. We get the same error in the command line, which is great. You can pretty print that too. Is it -- pretty? Yeah, look at that. So I added the pretty flag so that we would get like, you know, pretty output showing what our problem is. It actually brought in a code snippet, which is pretty cool. But I'm going to now do npm start just to run our application. I moved something. Oh, okay. So I moved the entry point into my app. So I need to go into package.json and say that it's actually now in dist. User error. Okay, so now we're running on port 5000. Oh, okay. Oh, and this is another error. So I have a static route defined to serve jQuery from node modules, but I'll show you real quick why I did it that way. And there's probably a much cooler, better way to do this, by the way. But what I wanted to be able to do, since I'm not bundling, if you were doing bundles, you could handle it, or if you were using CDNs, you could do this differently. But I didn't want to path into node modules here. So what I did was I just set up a static express route. Yeah, I went one level down, so I need to fix my path. So inside of this index.js, this is that I basically say if the path is vendor/jQuery.min.js, go to, and I'll just need to add another up. npm start. And I didn't do that right, apparently. What am I doing wrong here?
Demo server node mod.
Yes,
Because
pull
it's-
over
yeah,
one more.
It's getting cut off, so you can't see what it's getting like.
It's like server node modules.
Oh, you know what?
Supposed to be
Let's
higher level.
let's make sure. Excuse me.
Can you have to go one more?
Yeah, you're npm.
You're in
modules,
server.
or no modules.
You're on. You need to go up.
You need to go up one.
Oh, it's still a pathing issue? Really?
Yeah.
I'm in. So wait, I'm in dist. I go up to server, and then I'm in the root of my project, right?
Wasn't index HTML also?
I'm wondering if I just don't have that package in here. Let's take a look. Oh, jQuery's there.
But the
Huh.
error said it was looking in server. Yeah, so it's
Oh, I see what you're saying. Demo, server. Oh, yeah, that's not right. I don't remember having to do that.
You have to change some.
Have you built since you changed that?
No, thank you.
We're gonna need to remove whatever.
Now I need to remove this.
So, one thing I wish. Have you talked about the watch using TSC?
No. What is this another flag?
-W.
-W? Oh, but then I can't. I'd have to open up another terminal window to run node, and then I'd have to watch reset the process. I'd have to put nodemon on there to reset node, right?
Yeah.
I'm not going to do
You
that.
You could run nodemon and run some execs
So-
behind the scenes.
So what Ken's bringing up here is that what I'm having to do here is not what you want to do when you go back to your desk tomorrow and start to set this stuff up. You want to set up a proper development environment that is watching your files and not only rebuilds your project, but reloads Node. And if you're a real Node developer, unlike me, you would just do this by default. Like you would just automatically do that, right? I'm a noob. I'm not doing it. So, but I also want you to see the repetition so that you'll know exactly how to run this command when you need to. See? I'm going to do that about another 25 times tonight. Okay. And then I'm going to run npm start. And with any luck, that's the magic right there. All right, so there's our application. So we had an error. So going all, let's unwind this a little bit. Going all the way back to our book.ts, we have this compilation error, but the TypeScript compiler still admitted the JavaScript, even though the error was present. Now, we can change that. We could go into tsconfig and we could say, no omit on error, and set that to true. Now, if we compile and there's an error, it's not going to admit the JavaScript. Do you also need to proactively clear your output folder, or does it do that for you?
When you, no, you have to clean.
Yeah, I would have to go in and clear that, kill that folder before I call TSC in order for it to be empty, like empty. But I'm not going to do that. Instead, let's fix it. So the way that I'm going to fix this is I'm going to bring in what's called a d.ts file. So I'm not going to migrate rating.js to be TypeScript. Instead, I'm going to say rating.d.ts. And then I'm going to, let's see, how do I want to do this? I'll say interface rating. And I'm going to cheat here just to speed. Oh, I'm actually going to declare it as a class. So declare class by putting declare in front of it. Oh, let's export this guy so it knows that it's a rating. Okay. By putting declare in front of it, I can write my interface as if it was a class, but declare means I don't have to like give implementations for everything. It's like this, I don't know how you'd even like further describe that. It's like using classes as interfaces, but by putting declare there, you don't have to like provide implementations for all your methods. Is that fair?
Yeah.
So I can say username string, rating, number, and comment string. And then the one thing that I want to add then is I'm going to say constructor, username, string, rating, number, and comment is string. Now I believe, now that I've said that, I think I could have just, and we'll try this just to see, I think I could actually do this just as an interface. And I think you would call this new instead of constructor. Let's try that and see if that works. Really? The keyboard binding for comment selection is hooked up to something else. That's so annoying. Oops. What? Oh, my hand hit the trackpad. Okay. So we've defined an interface. Interface, if you aren't familiar with them, think of it as a code contract. We can describe the shape of the class without providing implementations. So here we're describing the constructor and what the parameters should be, but there's no body to the constructor. And then I'm just exporting this, which makes this a module. Now, when we come over to book, and it's still giving us an error. Oh man, I should have used. We still have the problem here, but the way to fix this is to change const to an import. And instead of module exports, we set this to export. Why are you
I have
unhappy?
a question. Is there a problem with?
No, I think.
Oh, I got to change. Yes.
I was going to ask you, would you not need to call an interface like audio rating or something?
That's up to you. I believe in the TypeScript official website right now, they're advising people not to add the I.
But there's no conflict here, I guess.
No. What I'm doing wrong here is that because I'm targeting ES6, the default value logic for the module setting is saying, oh, if you're using ES6, you probably want to use ES6 module syntax. So we actually have to go in and say module common JS to get that to clean up. Okay, and we're still not happy with this. So I'm going to change. Interesting. Well, I'm just going to go back to what I know works. I'm not sure why the interface. Rating only refers to a type, but it's being used as a value here. So it's not understanding that I can call it as a constructor. It's expecting a type to new up. And so I think what I'm doing wrong is
the naming of your export, I think is what the problem is.
We have two things called rating. What's inside rating.js? I don't never see that very much.
let's go back to the other example because I know it works, and then we can. I don't think it's my import, Ken. What did you see that I was doing wrong?
I think the way you named your export is you're naming it with it's not a module. You're exporting an interface rather than exporting a module. I believe when you're looking at your definition file.
That's right. I want setting export to rating. I want the class to be the module. That is equivalent to module.exports when you replace the exports object. That's the equivalent syntax in TypeScript for that. That keeps you from having to do the other way that you can do this, and I'll show it in a sec. But we can come back to that. What I wanted to show was that now it's working. There's something about how I'm setting up my interface that's not right. Now it thinks we can new up an instance because I'm using a class as my definition. I believe there is a way to create the interface to do that, and I'm not sure why that's not working. I'd have to research that. I don't know off the top of my head what I'm doing wrong there. It has something to do with how I'm identifying the constructor, because that presence of the constructor is sort of the key element there, right? But now that we have that, notice that we have, rich type information, and our implementation. Oh, and we can get rid of this now. This is redundant. We can kill that. Our implementation is still just a regular JavaScript file, but we're still getting full type information inside of here. And going back to Ken's original question, that if we say let R equal new rating, and if we pass in a number and a string and a number, it will now tell us that a number is not assignable to a string for that parameter. And the reason why that's happening is because we're inside of a TypeScript file now, right? That was the one file we changed in our entire project to a .ts. Now the compiler is going to be very specific with how we're calling that, and it will tell us that we're wrong. Okay? The point that being there is to show you sort of the progression, right? That you can use JSDoc comments before you add any TypeScript to your project. Once you start adding TypeScript, you're going to end up on this, what I would call a slippery slope, where you're going to have to start to add these d.ts files if you want to leave JavaScript files in your project, okay? If you're just going to go whole hog and just say, I'm going to change everything over to TypeScript, you won't have to add this d.ts file that I added. To be clear, I'm adding that because I want to not change my implementation. Okay? Now, going back to the module syntax, there is another way I can do this. We can get rid of our export here, and we should be able just to say export default. But then but that's okay. But that's not going to allow me to do what I want to do. Well, interesting. How does that work?
It's a whole new world, TypeScript 2.2.
I don't have a body for my constructor.
No, but it's not an implementation because you're in a d.ts file.
Ah, it knows that I'm in a declaration file, and therefore I don't need the implementation. Interesting. So that should be equivalent, and it's not. It's blown.
So, oh yeah, right.
Let's try this though. No.
I bet you have a default on that. Raising that default.
What do you want me to do?
I was just saying in your TypeScript file, I think if you type rating.default, you would find that you have a default property in the default number. That was weird.
No, still not gonna. But if we go into here now and take this off, that worked.
Like a proper TS file, d.ts file, I don't even know what they look like.
Oh, excuse me, a
Like
what?
a proper d.ts file, like, I
That's-
don't know, is that basically what they look like? I've never heard of them.
Yeah, I haven't actually spent a lot of time writing definition files. I think that's what Ken was going to talk about, was writing definition files. So I couldn't do it. I couldn't do export default, but I could just export that. And when I did the export, I had to use destructuring to grab the rating class out of, because without doing the default,
That's not true destructuring, by the way.
it's destructuring syntax. Wait a second. It's not true destructuring. Explain
it's
yourself.
not that you can't. You can assign when you're doing proper destructuring, you can assign
Default values.
to variables and
So, well, how would you describe that syntax?
import.
Import syntax?
ES6 import syntax. That's all it is.
I like mine better. So by doing export, we could have more than one export out of the same d.ts file, and then we could come over here, and you could pull out the ones that you care about, right? That's all that's doing. What's interesting? One last thing I'll show you. What's interesting about that is that if you look at the resulting book.js, notice that it's changing that. Oh wait, I should compile this. Oops. Notice that it's converting that import into a require. So the compiler knows that I told it was common JS, so it's just translating the imports. Because are those supported natively in Node yet? Can you use the import syntax?
In Node?
Yeah, they haven't embraced that yet. There's an ongoing discussion, I know that, but they... 7 did
I
they?
think that's what, I remember reading that discussion.
Yeah, it's...
I haven't touched 7,
So eventually Node is going to switch over to using the syntax that everyone else is using, and they're going to let go, I believe, of the legacy syntax, but there's a battle in terms of how to do that, I think.
I think that main problem with HTML stuff, yes, people aren't switching to 7.
Got it, okay. So it's coming eventually, and what that would allow you to do is just always use the same syntax and not have to have this sort of, the common JS syntax will slowly die over time, so. Okay, I think I will end on that. To be honest, there's still like a whole, there could be a second hour-long talk that just like sort of iterates through all the little like gotchas. Like for instance, just as an example, if you have a function that relies upon the arguments object instead of defined explicit parameters, you'll need to do special coding to make that work well with TypeScript. by adding function overloads. If you have a constructor function that attaches methods through the prototype, you'll need to jump through some hoops if you're not planning on changing that code to be a class. If you wanted to rewrite that as a class, then it would just work. But if you don't want to rewrite that code, you're going to end up having to define an interface for those prototype methods that you're attaching to that constructor function. There's a whole list of these things. None of them are insurmountable, like on their own, but there are things that if your code base uses any of those patterns, and those are pretty common things, so they probably do, you're going to be left with a choice of doing the cleanup or moving it to a different syntax. And the good news there is that there's lots of great resources online that will walk you through. I mean, those are pretty common problems, I guess, is kind of what I wanted to get at there. And TypeScript's been out for almost 5 years now. So there's a lot of people who have done a lot of this kind of work, and so luckily there's a lot of people who have addressed these questions online. Real quickly, if you work on a team and you want to, the idea of hey, I think this is worthwhile to experiment with, but someone's on your team is like, I don't want to be bothered with that. One of the cool things that you might consider is to create TypeScript free zones, right? Just like you saw me there, how you could divide up your project, you could actually pick a single folder inside of a large client-side application and drop a JSconfig or a tsconfig file in there and just start doing TypeScript in a small part of the app. And if those developers aren't working on that section of or module of your application, they'll never know. So it's kind of a nice way to kind of do a skunk works to experiment with this and evaluate if it's valuable for your team without disrupting or interrupting people's normal workflow. The other thing you could offer too is that there is an escape hatch. You saw the compiled code is pretty close to what you would normally write, and in a lot of cases it won't touch it at all. It'll strip out the static typings, but it won't rewrite the intent of your JavaScript. You can actually use that to your advantage. I've never known anyone who's actually done this, because I think they've stayed with TypeScript. But you could delete your TypeScript files and bring your compiled JS files back into source control and move forward from there, right? It probably would not be as trivial as I just made it sound, but it would not be impossible to do either, right? Resources, the official TypeScript site keeps getting better all the time. They have a lot of great walkthroughs and tutorials on there. It's really got a lot of great rich content. Basirat Al-Saed's TypeScript Deep Dive book is a free book online on GitBooks. It's been a really great, valuable resource. I always like to recommend that.
Changes as the new versions come out.
Yeah, he's totally on top of it, and he's active on Twitter. So if you have questions, he'll respond to you, which is really great. And that's it. So you can find me online at these places, and the demo that I just showed you, the finished end product, and I wrote a lot of supporting individual demos that kind of led up to the all-up demo. All that code is up there in this repo if you're interested in doing any exploration on your own. So.
Cool. Thanks, James.
I can just use your computer. I don't
Oh, okay. Yep, absolutely. And I
Just
will.
got this Surface book.
Yes.
I've got some novelty reserve cards if anyone's interested. The jQuery programmers only. You can mark it up, give it to someone, and then let them put it on the desk, and then put little quote marks around programmers. I've got font snubs only in Comic Sans and of course. Anyway, if you don't want them, just leave them. It's
Move tools.
Move tools now. Let's see. So let's see. It's a little bit of a preaching to the choir, although I've got this presentation's got a little bit of a similar feel to James's talk, but yeah, sort of like why I like type things. Let's see, why TS. Okay. Okay, so that's my Twitter. I thought, it's not that funny.
That's especially true today.
I know, that was today's, yeah.
Notice he got the Philip.
Philip, kids are impressed with that, you know. Yeah, I wrote a bunch of books too. That seems to impress people. But fun, shocking statements. This is good, like if you're at a party or something and you want to just, provoke people. These are true things that actually I've said and I've seen said. One of them, just the fact that I do any kind of work that's related to Flash, I repeat this and I tell them, and then I repeat it, and it's like, yeah, okay, live video, there's actually a niche there. But just the other night, actually, you were there at that Node user group. Some guy was showing an interface to this Java, or he's got some tool and he showed how it's solved in Java. And he had to explain like 3 times that Java is blocking. You go to a line of code, it waits until it's done, until it goes to the next line. And people had to be told 5 times. And similarly, just the other day, I mentioned to a programmer who's never touched JavaScript that it's basically not typed. And he's like, what? What you had to explain and say, well, it's loosely typed. And anyway, so those are all shocking statements. And to me, it's like you're a masochist if you don't take advantage of it. Avoid stupid mistakes. Now, I included that because I know some of you are a little bit more amateur than me, so that doesn't apply to me. I've never made a stupid mistake. So, but if this happens to you, all the little tips and tricks that your IDE can do. Once you say this is a string, it just gives you a lot of stuff. Short-term memory loss. I don't know if you remember the different properties in that one rating. If you don't remember them, that's fine because you use the tools to help you. That's the whole, to me, like the big sell. And you don't have to memorize APIs. Just a simple example, I'm figuring out Node now as well, and just like the file system class or whatever module, just fs dot, and then the whole documentation's right there. I don't need to go look up stuff. And it's not that I'm saying don't learn it, you just don't need to learn some of these things. And so, in balance, there's a little bit of getting it configured. Okay, in any situation, you have your workflow and your entire project that you have to get configured anyway. But granted, figuring out the tool set, it's not nothing. And in retro, I tried to take some really gnarly code and have it look at it in ES3, and I thought, oh, there's going to be some JavaScript that's unmaintainable. But it's really not that bad. It's sort of a stretch to say this is perfectly good to commit as your source, but it's not as bad as it seems. And this last point, I don't know if this is actually a true statement, but you're pretty much, if you're going to use TypeScript and compile, it lets you do all the fancy new ES whatever and compile down to whatever version, like Babel does, but it's putting them together, I don't see how that works. Maybe there's a workflow that does.
I actually have heard someone who had a use case for that.
Sure.
Going back to earlier versions of TypeScript, to use async await, you had to be able to have ES6 support for generators in your runtime, but Babel had a transpilation down to ES3, ES5. So people were using async await in TypeScript to create generators, and then transpiling with Babel down to ES3, ES5.
So the double pro.
Yeah, it sounded crazy,
yeah.
but people were
Yeah.
actually recommending
So
that
they were
online.
downsampling to ES6 from TypeScript, right?
Yep.
And then Babel was downsampling to ES5
Yep.
or ES3.
By the way, you don't need to do that anymore. As of 2.1, async await down compiles to ES3, ES5, but prior to
I've still been
2.1,
holding back on my browser code because I was like, I don't want to break something. But
yeah.
that's
Anyway,
But yeah, that's generally the thing that you're sort of buying into using the compiler from TypeScript, and if they are slightly behind some new feature and then making it totally work in a polyfill or whatever, you're at the burden of what they produce. So that's about the only negative, really. That people complain about the quality of the JavaScript. That's sort of lame, really, because I mean it's like saying, well, it turns into bytecode at some point. I don't like that. It's not pure open code, so it just is a little much. So things I was going to show: avoiding stupid mistakes, short-term memory, and you don't have to memorize stuff. Okay, so stupid mistakes. Here is an interface. Basically, I said there's this thing called a render item, and those are the types. The first one, I said the type can either be, or I should say those are the properties. The first one can be either quote, slide, or video. But you know, look at duration, it's a number and so forth. So I just sort of designed this thing, and I'm loading in all these render items. And so if I just make a variable, I say it's going to be a render item by doing the colon type. As soon as I start typing, it shows me all the things that match just in my file. That's not too impressive. So it already knows I've got this my render item. And then as soon as I type it and type dot, at this point now I want to set the length, or was it duration, right? You don't know which one. And you could go back to that interface and take a peek, but of course you don't need to do that. Your IDE, just by saying it's a render item dot, it shows you all the elements that you declared in this interface. So, I mean, it seems like obvious. It's like, okay, I get what's going on. Well, some people don't operate this way. They just remember it's called duration, and I guess they're perfect. So if you don't want to rely on yourself, you can type it. And then once I did set the duration, it knows it's supposed to be a number. If I tried putting a string, it gives me little squigglies. And I kind of equate this to using a Word document editor with spelling. Now I can see a case for using just a plain text editor for creative writing. You don't want to get slowed down when it starts telling you your grammar's wrong or whatever. And in fact, in a tool like Microsoft Word, I turn off the grammar part, but I like the spelling. And it's kind of like, if you don't like that, I don't get it, but that's the advantage. And then it goes further. Of course, your functions, you can declare what the parameters are and what data type it returns. And then I said that it helps you avoid mistakes and avoid unnecessary tests. Here's a typical thing that you really have to do in JavaScript if you want it to be solid, is if you expect a parameter, and it's perfectly suitable to call this function without passing a parameter in JavaScript. So what your normal JavaScript code, if it's bulletproof, is going to have a bunch of these, making sure it's not null or whatever, and then taking corrective action. You don't need to do any of that. It's totally, it will, it's basically, I'm saying that's required, so it will show up. And I know it will be a number. And in case, I don't know if anyone ever feels uneasy that they're depending on the compiler or the language service to tell them all this stuff, but if it didn't work, you'd have bigger problems. That is, like, you have to just assume that's working. Occasionally you might find some bug somewhere and you have to help them fix it, but it works, so that's like the premise. So short-term memory, what was the property inside there? You don't need to memorize anything, and that's great for me because I don't know, I don't have good short-term memory. Long-term is great. You don't need to learn the API, and here's something I mentioned. You just say, I'm going to be using this thing, and it's go look inside that FS, or find out what this FS thing is, and then bang, it shows me all the whole API. And then as soon as I type one in the append file, it shows me the parameters, the types. Little question mark says it's optional, and then it shows me the data types within the data types. I mean, it's pretty useful. So the downsides, just to be fair, the tooling. I've never tried working with Sublime or WebStorm to make TypeScript work. Maybe they have good solutions. Atom seemed like a pretty good solution for a while. Visual Studio proper. I tried it for a while, and it looked like it does a lot of stuff, but at this point, I just think VS Code is more suited. It's definitely lightweight, and I've opened up JavaScript projects, didn't touch a thing, didn't do this JS config, and it gave me, the ability to jump around. So that makes that editor very attractive. The only down thing I can say is possibly you get a very complicated project. I can imagine maybe it gets a little slow on lower end machines. I don't know.
Just to clarify, if you're using modules, you don't need JS config.
Okay.
The reason why that first example I showed wasn't using modules.
Sure.
So.
Yeah. It adds a lot of stuff just free that comes with the software, I guess is the point about VS Code. So that's my vote at this point. But well, I think I kind of take most of this back. But if you have a workflow system, or you're using Webpack, and then someone doesn't like the fact that you're compiling code and putting it's kind of the same argument no matter what part of the workflow you're at. Yes, if you use TypeScript, you're going to have this other layer of dependency, and it's not necessarily a bad thing. But you do have this sort of doomsday thing. The JS that it produces is not impossible. I've had worse. I've looked at, I mean, I've tried, even stuff I've produced is worse than the JavaScript it produced. Okay, so I asked this before. It's pretty much, I think it does. But just kind of briefly on TypeScript. Okay, yes, you could have a very academic conversation with someone about how it's not really classes. Well, ES6 maybe it is, but I think it does some magic. If you look at what it compiles down to when you deliver to ES5 or whatever, you can see that it's doing some funny stuff. And there's this thing, prototypical, inheritance. I'm pretty darn familiar with it, but it really doesn't matter when you're trying to do a project. If you're trying to solve the thing, people have said object-oriented programming is dead, and it's not as trendy, and it's definitely, you can do very functional things in TypeScript. And in fact, in the last point there, if you can do it in JavaScript, you can do it in TypeScript. I mean, it totally works. So you can use whatever pattern you want, but I'll use object-oriented just for data structures. I mean, this is like a super simple example of using interfaces just to describe the shape, to model my data and the shape of the data. I'll use object-oriented patterns, until somebody takes away from me, because it's just the way to go. So I think those are all kind of sort of weak arguments against it. It's good to talk about and understand and appreciate, but that's just my last little bit. And then those slides are there. I don't know if anyone can add anything. They think I gave short shift to something because this is the first time I put this together, and I think it's something I might want to develop more for people who are more of my target. I mean, you guys have committed to like showing up at the TypeScript club without wearing a bag over your head, but people resist. Has anyone ever seen any resistance to TypeScript? Yeah, I'm sure. So.
Great.
So why and what is their problem? And are there other points that are valid that I skipped?
I mean, the big one I always hear is, oh, I don't want to compile. It's like, oh, we already have modules, and it's already there, and why would you do that?
To a server, you have a process, right? So it's the same thing, right?
Yeah.
The argument of compiling.
I mean, like to me, like it makes sense. It's like, oh,
sure.
yeah, that totally makes sense.
But it's an argument.
Else.
Yeah.
Like, oh.
You probably have a back-end server doing some sort of
You go build flows and all that
Well,
stuff
and
like
if
that.
you're not using TypeScript, who's not using Babel? Yeah, I mean, like,
That's
Well, maybe we're just really just bleeding edge, like, I don't know. You have to be using it on the newer framework.
if you're using React,
Yeah.
right? I mean, and I don't know. Like okay, I'll grant you, not everyone's using React, but it sure seems that way when you go.
If you're using jQuery, you're probably not using TypeScript or Babel.
Fair enough.
There might be an argument for like a large project, I think, too. If you have like thousands of files and they're just disorganized and everywhere. You don't want this continual churning process in the background.
Oh, I've heard that it's slow too, and I haven't
So-
experienced.
Well, no, that's totally not true.
Yeah,
It's
yeah.
how you write it.
Yeah.
It's what's going on here.
And there must be pre-compiling parts of your project. I've never had to address that. But you say, I'm not going to touch these files. It doesn't revisit it when it runs in the background.
Well, you now have the ability to have inheritance on your TS config. So you could potentially take your large project and break it up across modules and only compile the modules that are changing. Right?
You know what, the one guy said, he must have had it set up wrong, was that every time he had the process run, if he hit save or whatever, it would go through and recompile these other outside libraries.
You can turn that off.
Yeah.
That's pretty recent though, actually.
Mm-hmm.
I think that was introduced in 2.0. You can go into the compiler options and say don't. It's not just whether or not it's compiled. Well, okay, there's two things there. Now that I think about it, you need to exclude node modules so that it's not actually trying to compile in there. But you can actually go a step further now and tell the compiler to not check the typings in node modules, which it makes your language service at design time more responsive. Because if you have a lot of dependencies, the TypeScript service will reach in there and it will validate when it's first touched that the definition files in there make sense. Like, are they actually valid? And if they're not, you'll get errors in those dependencies, but you can tell the compiler to ignore those things, and which will speed up your compilation a lot too. So,
What are the negatives?
I think the thing that I always like to remind people, if you're coming from like C#, Java, and you don't know JavaScript very well, this can give you a false sense of security that, oh, this feels more familiar to the statically compiled code that I write day in and day out, so it makes my life easier. Don't stop that from learning how JavaScript actually works. If you don't invest the time to learn things like prototypical inheritance, eventually it will get you. Like, eventually something will behave in a way that runs contrary to how your mind is wired to think of inheritance in Java or C#, and something will just like not be working, and you'll be banging your head against the wall wondering what the heck is going on. Invest the time, to learn the language. That would be my advice.
Yeah, that's a good argument. Is that it
if
can
you've
give you a
learned
false
Java or
sense.
C#, you can absolutely learn JavaScript. It's none harder.
But the false sense of security, or that it's
Yeah.
people do get weirded out that it's doing too much for them, and you start seeing the fact that it adds the type any, or if it sees that that's being treated like a string, it thinks that you must think it's a string, and that's a little creepy. But
Yeah.
I prefer my code to rather yell at me and make me a dumb mistake before it goes to build flow.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
I'm going to venture to guess that over time you're going to see a lot of this configuration and setup continue to fade into the background, and things will be even more automatic. Maybe not ever completely 100%, but I think you're going to start to see a lot more implicit things happening. In the last year, there's already been a lot of changes, like the stuff that I was showing you tonight with mixed projects and auto type acquisition now. We didn't even talk about it tonight, but when you're in VS Code and you start requiring in packages that you've brought in, it behind the scenes will just acquire the definitions. It will tell you. You'll see a little thing pop up that says, "Hey, I'm fetching the type information for that thing that you just required," and you used to have to do that manually. And so there's just like they're improving all the time, trying to make it easier for people to adopt.
yeah, and it does add some config files for your project, but it's all in one clean folder. And in fact, as far as the Git integration in code, I have not touched that. When I started to play around, and I know maybe if I spent the time, I could figure it out, but it just I let it run the tasks, or just a simple compile task. But
Yeah. I do think there's a relationship between how open you are to the idea of TypeScript and how much of a testing culture you have. If you practice TDD, you probably are going to be less convinced of the value of adding static types to your JavaScript.
yeah, but I do think you can avoid a lot of the tests
Sure.
that people end up writing. Not no tests.
I'm not trying to suggest
Yeah,
that they're absolutely right, but I think
Sure.
that's you
It's
hear
a
a
good
common
point, yeah.
thread from people that
Sure.
hey, if we invest heavily in unit testing, maybe I don't need the compiler to tell me,
Sure,
that that's
sure.
properties right or wrong.
Yeah. I mean, the biggest is like when I'm sitting there coding, having the integrated IDE is just time saver. That's
Yeah.
all it is.
Okay,
Okay,
thank you.
thanks.
What you got?
All right, well, James just blew away my automatic type acquisition talk.
Oh no.
So.
Show us
No,
how it
that's okay.
works.
That's okay. It's really simple. You guys, you know how to use require JS or common JS. Oh, I don't know if I can use this. I'm on
One thing
Windows.
that messed me up.
That won't work?
You have to stop and start. That's
Bundle
fine.
into a single file. It's like,
What's that?
there's like limitations, like if you want to bundle everything into a single JS file, you can't use common or something. There's all these. It's not
That's not true if you're using Webpack, certainly.
All right.
Because maybe I'm
It's more
misunderstanding.
like it's like once you get it going the way you want, it's fine. It's just thinking around.
Well, I think those processes in general, they can be, I think, from straightforward to just extremely hard to understand sort of thing. Math will figure out what's going on.
All right, so I'm not giving it a real talk. I'm just making this up on the fly. But I'm going to take James's code that he wrote tonight, and I'm just going to kind of walk through some different features in Visual Studio Code, so you guys can get an idea of what the IDE has for you. It's not an IDE, sorry, it's an editor. But what you can do with it out of the box. So I have some extensions installed, but I'm not going to really be using those. So when you want to use your command prompt and you have a project, you can do something from the keyboard, which is a control tilde, which will open up, if you're on Windows, it'll open up PowerShell in the current context. So I'm in my user folder, but I'm going to change directory, and I'm going to make dir. And I'm going to cd into demo, and then I'm going to code dot. Code dot will open a new editor in the context of demo. So now I can take my control tilde, and you can see I'm in my PowerShell again. So I've got two editors open, one for entitled 1 and one for demo. I'm going to clone James's repo here.
Did you have to say in your preferences that you wanted your terminal to be PowerShell instead of command?
No, PowerShell is the default today.
Okay,
Yeah.
I didn't know that.
Can you set it up to be bash? Yeah, that is.
No, not in Windows.
Even with
You can change your console in Mac, but not in Windows. I don't know why, but maybe you can. I don't know. I tried it, didn't work. But you could just type in bash and get there.
In general, when opening up folders, do you have to create a new window every time? Like, is the scope of the window or the project like specific to the window itself? Or like multi-project or multi?
So if I had, say I wanted to CD into James's demo, right? I could have the context there, but I could open another window by doing code dot, right? So now I have the full repo and the single project. So I could have these things side by side.
Okay.
Searching, I think, is one of the immediate things I think of when you're
Yeah, like sometimes like I like to have my things on multiple projects
Right.
on one context, so I can jump around and do that sort of search
Right.
between the relationships.
James didn't set up any tasks for his repos, so I'm going to do that real quick. So, sorry, demo was server and public. Okay, so I'm actually going to go into that demo again.
Yeah.
Because that's really where I want to live.
That's an example of what you're just talking about, right?
So for this particular project, he's got one start task, but he doesn't have any sort of run task, right? So, well, the task that he has is start, but if I wanted to say serve, and I want to run nodemon, right? That will watch my files and stop and start the server as I go, right? But I also don't have nodemon installed, so since I have the console open, I just go npm install nodemon, and I'm going to do save dev. See if I'll get that bigger there. So now nodemon's installing. It'll add it as a dev dependency in my package.json, and then over here I'm going to do a task. So Control-Shift-P opens up the command palette, and I'm going to say task, and I want to do a run task, and I'm going to call it serve. And I don't have any tasks, so guess what? Let's try this. Task, configure task runner. I have to do that first, and I'm going to choose npm. That creates a VS Code folder and generates this task.json file. It's because I chose npm, it just went with some generic NPM tasks. I'm going to add a new one down here. Let's see if I can get that to work. Task name is serve, and I don't have to pass. Oh wait, I do have to pass. I do have to pass the args. So args are like what the commands are that I'm going to run, and serve. So this tells Visual Studio to run the npm run serve command when I do task serve. So now this little indicator down here at the bottom is saying there's something happening, and it's saying, and then I've got an output window saying that what's happening on the server. So nodemon tried to start, but it couldn't run node index ts. So I'm going to change that to run nodemon server index JS. And I need to stop the server. Control. And that's a control palette and task, terminate running task. So whenever you have a watch task that's continuously running in the background, you can't run another task in Visual Studio Code. You always have one task running.
I think it asks you to do.
If you tried to run another task, it would ask you, do you want to kill this task? Do you want to terminate it? But it wouldn't start that other task still. It would only terminate it. So you need to do terminate and then start another one. Oh, it's still failing. You know what? Index.js. I'm not sure what's happening here.
Did you npm install?
That's a good idea. I should do that. And you can have multiple terminals open. I only have one open right now, so this drop-down menu would show you the different ones you have. So if you wanted to have more, you could just toggle between them. So the one task that's running from Visual Studio Code's task runner, that can't be interrupted, right? So that is it. You get one, but you can run as many command windows as you want in the console. So I could run another TSC. TSC server. Where's your TypeScript?
I don't have that one.
Okay.
I don't have that checked in.
So if I had TypeScript files here, I could run tscp server and do a watch and have that constantly running. If he doesn't have a ts config there, so I could go ahead and create a new file, jsconfig.json, right? I don't know what we did before, but so this, and then ts jsconfig. So now the TypeScript compiler is going through all of those files, watching it from a terminal, not from in Visual Studio Code. So I can have that process going all the time and have nodemon just updating whenever it sees new JS files, which is the default behavior from nodemon. And you can also set breakpoints. We don't have any. Let me see.
Here's a question. How'd you get those icons in the preview? Usually Visual Studio doesn't show any icons.
Oh, in
Preferences.
here?
Yeah.
Yeah, so there's an extension.
Okay.
Just be just a
There,
preference.
there is a preference, right? There is file icon theme.
Is it just as fast with the icons? Or
I haven't noticed any slow
crash
down.
with like 10,000 files?
Yeah, I haven't had any issues with it.
Okay.
Yeah. So So I'm just going to see if I can get source maps working. See if I get generated files. Probably not going to work. I just want to get some files to
Where is it outputting files to? Oh, you just added it.
Maybe it's because the server broke.
He's showing how it won't overwrite the file.
Okay, so now I have a
Okay,
dist. I
I
have a
appreciate
dist
that.
folder.
I made that error myself recently.
So my dist folder will now be server. And then task terminate. Task serve. Okay, so now TypeScript's running in my terminal, watching my essentially my JavaScript files, and it's compiling them into a dist folder, which NodeMon is watching. So NodeMon's going to restart the server anytime it sees new JavaScript files, and TypeScript's going to recompile those anytime you make a change to a file. So you can have those running at the same time. The reason I wanted to do this was because I wanted to actually set up source mapping. So we have source map here. If you see the books routes has a source map in it, which wasn't part of James's original code. He didn't put a comment in his model saying, or I guess it wasn't a model, it was a route, right? He didn't put a comment down here on 16 saying, here's my source map. The TypeScript compiler did that for him. So what I can do is set a breakpoint here on this line 15 in the JavaScript file. I can come over here to this little bug icon with the cross out on it, and then I don't have a test runner right now, but I'm going to go ahead and tell my Visual Studio by clicking that little gear icon to create the launch file. So it creates this launch file, and it defaulted to something that I didn't like. Let me see. So I want to do attach to process node. That's what I want to do. So I'm going to go ahead and do that, and then so I'm going to run my Visual Studio or my NodeMon in debug. Stop that process, and then serve it again. So running it in debug will allow me to attach to it from within Visual Studio Code. So now if I click on this little drop down and say attach to process, which is the task I just set up, my debugger will launch, and it's asking me which process do I want to connect to. So I'm going to connect to this guy here. Oh, that's the wrong one. Maybe it's this one. Alright, let me go to output.
What could go wrong?
Yeah, on the fly. Alright. So one thing that you probably don't want to do is run NodeMon as a task in Visual Studio, because stopping and starting, let's see, terminate, isn't something that you want to really do within Visual Studio, or yeah, as a Visual Studio process. So if I run npm run serve over here from the command line, NodeMon can be restarted on the fly by typing rs enter, and that will restart the server, but won't disconnect the process. So now when I click on the play, and I click on that guy, oh shoot. You guys get the idea, right? So essentially you can have Visual Studio Code running all of your processes from the terminal, or you can use it as a debugger. What I was hoping to show you is that you can debug the code just by applying the source map flag to your TypeScript or JS config file, which generates the source map definition for you. So setting the breakpoint in the left-hand column is really easy to do, and then hitting the play button if you have a process already running. Now, your process needs to have debugging run. So if you don't have debugging through NodeMon or running Node through the debug BRK, which you can do as well, you wouldn't be able to do it.
You could just kill NodeMon and try it from Node and see. Well, or just start it within Visual Studio Code.
Right, I could launch it through Visual Studio Code.
I've never tried the attach to process. I've always just let code start the server itself.
There are no entries to pick from.
So we had a couple, 3 months ago, we had like a hack night, and it was a very small group of us here, but there was someone who came in and said, I want to debug client-side code in Visual Studio Code, in tandem with Chrome, right? So you, within here, set a breakpoint in your, and we were just, I think it was just a JavaScript project, just to keep it simple, but he was wanting to set breakpoints in here, kick off a debugging session, have Chrome open up, but hit a breakpoint in code, not in the debugger tools in Chrome. And we actually got it working. There's that extension, but I got to tell you, it's not as simple as like, oh, install the extension, and it doesn't work.
If you're like me,
it took us like an hour to get this.
If you're like me and you're working on multiple different projects, configuring Visual Studio Code to debug your node is easy, but configuring it to do Chrome is a lot more complicated.
Yeah,
and you're like, which project am I on today, and did I set up the debugger for it? And no, I'm just going to go to Chrome and open the DevTools.
If you have source maps set up, like Ken was showing you, you can set breakpoints in your TS code in the Chrome DevTools, so you can still debug into your TypeScript code in the browser, and it's way simpler to do. Like, there's very little config you need to do to get that to work.
Right.
Getting it to set breakpoints in code, which would be really cool, and it is possible.
Let me open another project that I know will work.
Do you find code's debugging environment to be more enjoyable to use than DevTools?
I definitely like code's debugging environment.
So you are willing to incur the pain of the setup in order to debug in code.
Right. So this particular app that I'm running is this website. I've set up the task runner to have a launch task, which targets. Oh, that must be what I did. So now I'm thinking back to how I configured this. So you need to. There's a little bit of setup that goes in, a little bit of ceremony that goes into this. But and this code was written when Visual Studio Code was like at 1.0, so it's been a while. So I'm not launching a separate process and then attaching to it. This is actually just going to go out and look at my TS file, and then it also looks for the equivalent JS file in that folder. So it's running against the JS, However, it's going to allow me to debug my TS, right? So I'm not telling it anything other than the extension is TS. And that's all it really cares about right here. When I click launch, I set a breakpoint. It starts in the debug console. It shows me that the server is running. I ended up on my first breakpoint. I can see what directory name I'm in. I can start to see in this left-hand column, I can start to see stuff, you know, what the runtime is, you know. This code right down here hasn't been executed yet, so I'm going to go ahead and just, well, you know what, I'm not going to set a breakpoint. I'm going to step over, and then see what you know, executes next. So nothing executed, but I didn't hit any breakpoints, what I should say, right? But the server is running, and it's talking to some third-party services, so it's logging to the console. And now when I go hit a route, let me just get a route going here. So that breakpoint I just set was on the About CSG Pro page. So now my Visual Studio Code icon is blinking at me down here. So I'll go down there, and I'm here at the line I set the debugger on. So I can see what the request was that came in. I can even go down here into the console and type in request dot status. Request dot. So then I can look into the headers here and see what information's there, or I can look over here in the debug window and get the stack trace and all that stuff if I wanted to, right? Cool. You can get pretty deep. I mean, it's just the same experience that you'd have in Chrome, but I'm running a Node app, right? So it's worth looking into if you guys are building TypeScript and Node. So I think that's all there is to say. Any questions on this? No?
You got it.
Cool.
Cool. That's neat. Thank you.
All right. What's that? Candy? You got to put your name on that board and next time.
Oh, no, I don't.
Carry on.
Unless there's anyone else that wants to talk about something?
Yeah.
No, not this time? All right. Well, thanks for coming, everyone.
Thank you.
Appreciate your support.